So let's get started. So Patrick Reed is a Joseph C. Ford Professor of Engineering at Cornell University. He got his undergraduate degree at the University of Missouri in geological engineering, and then his PhD at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And upon graduation, actually, UIUC gave him a prize for the best, the Ross Martin Award for Outstanding Research Achievements, given to the best PhD students across all the different disciplines in engineering. His first job was at Penn State, and then in 2013 he moved on to Cornell University. And his research examined sustainable water management given conflicting demands from renewable energy systems, ecosystem services, expanding populations, and climate change. The tools in his group bridge sustainability science, risk management, economics, multi-objective decision-making, operations research, computer science, and high-performance computing. And his decision support tools are widely available and also widely being used. He's going to tell us today about some of his applications in the context of multi-attribute conflicts and decisions. Please welcome Pat Reed.
Thank you. No, it's exciting to be here. I appreciate the invitation. So just to sort of, these are three pretty big words: conflict, coordination, and control. And so water, to put simply, it's heavy, it's contentious, and it's typically, we've struggled to manage it, to even fully understand the risks. So what I'm going to show you today is a long-term collaboration. So the work was actually done by my former PhD and postdoc, Julianne Quinn, who's now faculty at University of Virginia. And this represents a very long-term, actually, collaboration with Politecnico di Milano. So my co-authors at Milano are Matteo Giuliani and Andrea Castelletti. Some context is that, so since humans have been living next to water, we've been trying to use rule bases to understand what state of the system is and are we safe. You can Google the Nilometer, and it goes back to basically stage of the river and whether or not you're in famine or flood. Now, one of the questions that we have now with the changes from climate change and human population and things like that, and this is from a recent New York Times article, is it's pretty bad when you have major operators going public in a major forum saying basically we don't know how to operate our system anymore. It wasn't designed for this. And so, and this is, he's referring to in this particular case the bomb cyclone aftermath in Nebraska and everything that's happening real time right now. And they're facing a very legitimate question. Do we hold and, in essence, try to dissipate risk downstream and put the reservoirs at structural risk for catastrophic failure, or do we release and we put downstream at risk? Is a very direct question that's being asked there. I thought this is an interesting and pertinent example, and I think this example is happening all over the world. More specifically, the talk today is going to be focused on the Red River in Vietnam, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. Just to provide some overview context, so when we're thinking about the sort of evolution of these food, energy, water systems, and particularly reservoirs, that's typically where you're at. And thinking about what are the risks and their potential for resilience or adaptive capacity. One of the challenges that we're facing is we really need to better model the extremes. So these are systems where we have limited observations, and how extreme can be is actually not well resolved typically. And whether or not our models actually get at the real failure modes of the systems. Do we actually understand the mechanisms of failure? And beyond mechanisms of failure, one of the core here, and this is not necessarily a surprise, but it has nuances and implication, human preferences, trade-offs, and conflicting demands, and thinking about, do we actually represent what the real humans do? There's a lot of model-based vulnerability analysis that, quite frankly, doesn't represent what actually happens in the systems, and then as a consequence doesn't represent the actual vulnerability, risk, or resilience of the system. And a lot of the work that I'm sharing today, and in general that we've been working on for quite a long time, is we're trying to provide a platform for understanding sort of the state of the system, what actions can be taken, and what are the consequences of those, and thinking of this as feedback as a function of the actual information that the human operators or planners and managers have at the time that they're making their choices. So, the context, Red River Basin, it's the second largest river in Vietnam. You have the capital city of Hanoi that faces existential threats from monsoonal flooding. So, in particular, you have an estimation of average annual damages of $130 million basin-wide through the delta, and within Hanoi itself of about $50 million US dollars. In response to this existential threat, which is not atypical, they built major storages. So the idea is to take out the amplitude, the height and the trough in terms of floods and droughts. And so this is actually Hoi Bin, which is the largest of the storages. It's in series with Son La. You have Thác Ba and Tuon Khang. And then you have Hanoi here. So when you build a reservoir, inevitably other demands emerge besides the original intent. So one of the other questions is having this multi-billion-dollar investment in significant storage volumes and the potential for management is exactly how should you coordinate the management for the overall basin, and in particular thinking about the delta and Hanoi. So one of the interesting issues is now they're very dependent on hydropower. So 46% of Vietnam's total installed electric power capacity. This is likely to reduce over the next coming years because of compressed natural gas and some other investments. Nonetheless, hydropower is significant. They also do not have an open market. This is a subsidized, controlled market with fixed pricing. The reservoirs also are a large part of their sort of agricultural identity. So 70% of the Vietnamese population is employed at agriculture at present, and 76% of Vietnamese agriculture is irrigated. And you do have a variety of different types of agriculture. This is the third most productive rice production zone in Asia, specifically in the Red River. So, one of the challenges is you have Vietnam that's actually transforming. You may have read in the popular press that the countries that are actually, in essence, benefiting from the tariff discussion between the US and China are countries like Vietnam. And so they have an explosive population. They also have an explosive economic expansion. So the face of Vietnam is changing and changing rapidly. So what does the future portend? You have shifts in the sectoral decomposition of their economy in the longer term. You have a shift towards services. They've made one of the largest structural investments in educating their population of any country in the region in that regard. And as a consequence, their growth rates have been fairly substantial. So you have changing sectoral demands. You have changing sort of dependencies. The other thing, the only situation that has largely been normal in the region is a shift between flood and drought. So you have here, this is 2010, 2016, over here 2017. And one of the things is, in 1 year, you shift from the rice production being completely in peril to it being flooded. And so you get this cycle of variation. So they're struggling in this. They've built these storages. It's not a hypothetical problem. So things that they want to do in a very simple sense, in a narrative sense, is they want to maximize their hydropower production. They want to minimize the deficit water. In essence, they want to make sure that they have the water they need for agriculture. And they want to minimize flooding at Hanoi. In rank order, the flooding at Hanoi is the most immediate, acute, and potential existential in that regard, but the others are still important. And this idea of deep uncertainties, there's not a consensus on the likelihoods and specific consequences of these risks and or the future evolution of what population is going to be impacted. So in that regard, one of the interesting things that we had the opportunity to do is work with the ministries at the actual level. And what we ended up being able to do is we built a model for the full system, and we actually have the real C code that is used to operate these reservoirs. It's over 1,000 lines. It's if, then, else. I'll explain in brief what that is, but this is not theoretical. They run this code and it says this is the release you're going to make every 6 hours. What do you have in terms of the structure of the model? You have, in essence, you have these contributing rivers. So you have 5 rivers. If you aren't into hydrology, these are largely difficult to control, you have a stochastic process that has extremes that are ill-defined. We don't know how bad the worst floods are. We don't know how bad the worst droughts are going to be, and the observation record is a limited representation. You have the potential flows going into the reservoirs where you now have an active human choice. One of the questions is what information should go and then condition those 6-hourly releases. And then you flow down into where you have a levee that has the potential for physical breach at Hanoi, which then you have catastrophic flooding and risk. What we're not modeling, but in the longer term we're interested in modeling, is the actually delta dynamics from sea level rise, but we do have a model capturing the estuarian interaction with the releases at Hanoi for flood risk. So one of the questions that is pretty standard in almost any system that you would go to in terms of how our actual river basins managed is they break them up in common decompositions. You can think of it as flood season, wet season, dry season, and between seasons. Obviously, I'm not going to give you 1,000 lines of code as a compelling presentation visual, but the narrative, one of the interesting things is they were quite sophisticated in the way that they're representing this, and they wanted to use a lot of state information to inform their actions. And in particular, when they go through this system and they think about it, and they're in the flood season, they want to determine the releases at Son La. So releases here, subject to what time of the year it is, what are the storages in your other reservoirs, and then a 48-hour forecast of level at Hanoi. So this is state information, and then what this basically means is they want to take the right action for the right context. So they want to use this information, and then you think about this is every 6 hours, right, over the course of management. So they go through Son La, then the next decomposition is then they determine Hui Bin. Now you have the releases at Son La, so you're trying to coordinate your information. And then you move through the reservoir system similarly through, and you condition your releases. Now, dry season is slightly different. So in the flood, what you're trying to do is you're trying to pull down your storage so you can catch a flood wave. Now, pulling down your storage reduces your hydropower. And it also puts you at risk in terms of the storages that you want longer term for other allocations, such as ag. When you move to the dry season, you want to fill your storages in this regard, which can be complementary to your hydropower production. And in this, you see the structure is basically, do we have the storage at a minimum level? If not, turn off your outflow. If so, then make sure that you're releasing at least at a minimum level. And it goes through the system again. It starts here slightly differently with the smallest and works its way through the smallest to the largest. Son La and Hui Bin have sort of a complex iteration in the process. So there's specific times of the year where there are releases for rice flooding the paddies through the canals. Otherwise, they have sort of a minimum release. And the way that they do this is they iterate between Son La and Hui Bin to make sure that Son La keeps Hui Bin's volume sufficiently high at the proper time to be able to do the rice flooding. And then discretion. So this is a little more complicated what that means. So there's a period of the year where they have absolute discretion in terms of release. Some folks would say that that's purely maximizing hydropower. But the problem is, at the front end of each of those seasons, you still have floods and droughts. And so there's some component to there in terms of this. So this is an abstraction, one framing of the problem that they're actually using. They run this, and they make releases in that regard. One of the challenges is that they're actually getting from relatively modest events, flooding levels that are unanticipated. So higher consequences than it should be based on the rule that they used. And it took actually several years to converge on this particular rule. Alternatively, we've worked collaboratively with them to sort of try to investigate why their current control rule may not be providing the level of protection that they anticipate that it could. And more formally, we've been doing a heuristic, stochastic, robust control approach. So where you have several objectives and high-dimensional control, and you're trying to really explicitly capture trade-offs. Sort of a mouthful here, evolutionary multi-objective direct policy search. Just walking through this in a more schematic sense, in essence, what we've done is their observations are about 80 years. We've built a statistical model where we actually replicate the statistics, the autocorrelation, the spatial correlation, but then we generated 1,000 statistically analogous, so you have a Monte Carlo framework. We get at the better sense of variability. Then what we do is we parameterize candidate operating policies. We take the same inputs that they use, and then we want to map to releases as a function of the time of the year. So we parameterize our policy, but we use a different form. This then becomes a search problem and a simulation problem. We simulate the candidate policies through the stochastic simulation. We compute the objectives, and then it becomes a search problem. This is one of the things my group also specializes in, is you don't want to necessarily be in the dominated space when you're worse in both objectives. So the question is, can we move through search towards the optimal trade-off or the Pareto frontier? And so you have this cycle of parameterization, simulation, optimization to create basically an alternate set of rules to compare by. So what do those rules potentially look like? Just diving in a bit, this is a Gaussian radial basis function. It's a universal approximator. You can think of it as linking to things like neural networks, although it's not the same. And without diving into too much detail, but the core of this is much the same. We want to know what ultimately in every 6 hours what the release is going to be at each of these reservoirs. We give it the same inputs that their rule system had, including the forecast and the stages and releases at the others. And at the heart of the search problem is how do we actually shape the policy? So there's lots of candidate policies, and so these are the parameterizations. It's a big dimensional collapse. And actually, so instead of having 1,000 lines of code of if, then, else, we have 30 lines of code in a relatively straightforward, but I would say more adaptive representation of action. And then again, the core is to map from the state of the system to candidate releases in a more flexible way. So as we move through this and we think about it, one of the questions is, well, how do they compare? So when we look at this, just to orient you, blue are what we searched. And so there's a trade-off set between 3 objectives. The flooding objective is basically measuring the height above 11.25 meters. This is the factor of safety that they want to stay below. And this is moving, and as you move up here, you're moving towards physical breach in Hanoi. So you want to be on this side to avoid breach. Over here, you have the hydropower that you produce in a given day. And then in terms of size, it's how much deficit you have. So ideally, you'd want to be a small blue dot up here. Doesn't exist. So one of the things that we can do is we can say, well, we can put a line for structural breach next to where their actual guidelines perform. So, and one of the things about this is how do you actually capture discretion in their guidelines? One of the things that we did is we actually substituted our own policies, every single one of the policies, to try to then maximize hydropower to get a reasonable representation. Regardless of what we do, you can see they're right at the breach point. So they're at physical breach with their rule system. And one of the things that we can do, sort of as I talk you through some of the results here, is just think about some candidate solutions across sort of the trade-off. So what I'm going to show you is a representative of doing very, very well in flooding, very, very well in hydropower, a compromise between those potential objectives and including decent performance in irrigation. And likewise, the best representative of their guidelines. And so we'll talk through this in a bit more detail. So one of the interesting things is, what if we look at a lot of statistical potential outcomes? So 100,000 years. And what we're mapping here, red is basically higher likelihood. And to orient you here, this is the total storage across the 4 reservoirs. Every time you build this, there's a finite space. There is a physical limit to any reservoir system where it's going to fail. Period. But what you would like is you are coordinated with your full volume as long as possible before you start to reach those thresholds. On this axis is the height at Hanoi. This is nuisance flooding. This is the factor of safety they want to stay below. This is physical breach. So if you're looking at this, you get a pretty substantial difference in terms of residual risk at breach. But actually the more interesting thing is that a lot of folks discount, particularly in the water side, is the structure of nonlinear thresholds of if, then, else. So it's a threshold rule. And unfortunately what you see is you're not even using a majority of your potential storage, and you're going to this point where you're getting at your factor of safety early. So you've spent substantially to mitigate your risk, and you're not fully utilizing. So there's the potential for poor coordination here. And in essence, you're maximizing the risk in the system inadvertently. Likewise, you see over here that in general we're transforming. We avoid that in general as extreme, and you're shifting and distributing out with the compromise solution in terms of better utilization. So one of the interesting questions then is that we only really looked at one source of uncertainty there, and that was sort of stationary statistics of hydrology. We used a lot of different replicate hydrologies. So what if there are big changes in human demands or monsoonal extremes? So this isn't to say that we're trying to predict exactly what's going to happen. Alternatively, we wanted to create an experiment to see how far we could take the system in each of these axes. And so we ended up looking at 7 factors, that sort of the changes in monsoonal dynamics, and then 4 socioeconomic factors in terms of agricultural demands. And as we do this sort of experiment, the intent is just for one of the rivers to show you a sense of it. Droughts live on this side, floods live on this side. So, and if we're thinking about this, this is the percent of the year that flow is below a certain level. And if we start actually a sampling experiment, we can change the mean or we can change the variance. And what this shows is the effect on that distribution as we change these experiments. And so this becomes an exploratory analysis. You can actually broaden out the states of the world that are possible. And this is one of the rivers. We did this across all the rivers and actually changing some of the harmonics and some of the other details. Likewise, you can take base case demands and start perturbing those in terms of timing and phasing or magnitude. And so one of the things about this that we wanted to do is create a backwards classification problem to see basically what are the factors that matter the most and for what specific values of those factors for specific levels of performance in the system. So one way to just introduce this, so you have from us the best flood solution and then the guidelines best flood solution. The goal here is to stay below this, your factor of safety, so that's the 11.25 meter level. So blue dots are those worlds that are sampled where you meet this condition, red is where you fail. And what you end up seeing in this experiment is that it's the monsoonal mean and variance that are the dominant factors in terms of what causes failure. Their guidelines have higher rates of failure, and another way to view this is sampling, outward sampling from our original assumptions. So you have these 2 major factors. And in essence, you can create a classification or regression problem, for example. So this is logistic regression. You can look at and map the probability of success of meeting this criteria across your sampled set of scenarios. And you can classify. And in this case, you could sharpen the boundaries. And so you could think of this side being the safer side and that side being the failure side, subject to your assumptions in this regard. And we could do this for each of our concerns. For example, hydropower, it's the same 2 factors that matter, but completely the opposite way. So in essence, on the flooding example, when it's safe, hydropower is down, and when hydropower is working, flooding is not safe. So you have direct opposition, and that's where the conflict comes. You can think of it in terms of the factors for deficit failures, so agriculture. So setting, and this is, we worked with the ministries in Vietnam in terms of these thresholds and used lots of different examples. But just to illustrate here, different factors come in, and it's not surprising. Agricultural demand and other potential demands into the system actually are defining the failure surfaces here. So in essence, if we take all those chops and we're showing it in the monsoonal change in terms of variance and mean, we can have this blue, which is basically a safe operating space, where you have a high likelihood of meeting all three requirements: your hydropower, your flooding, and your deficit. What you can see is that their guidelines are not in the safe operating space right now, as of today. One of the interesting things then, we worked with folks at Penn State. They took 20 climate model perturbations from a variety of 20 models, and then we downscaled that into the system. And we just wanted to see, in essence, across scenarios, what do these safe operating spaces look like, in essence, as a function of time of the year. All right, let's get the dynamic. There you go. And what you can see is the evolution of the scenarios. Are you in a drier or wetter future? And in this case, you can see very clearly that the current operating rules are just simply going to have to change. They're currently out of their safe operating space, and they're right on the edge of what we found. So one of the questions even still is further work that we're doing in terms of increasing. I mean, this is for a 100-year flood design criterion. Should we actually be going to the 500-year criterion? And if we do that, then what are the trade-offs attainable at that level? If you're trying to move into this space, it doesn't come for free, and the whole problem is shifting. Now, one of the things is, and this is a bit more mathematical, but I think it's still interesting, why? So why is it that we get what we get for these solutions? So adaptivity and information feedbacks, they put a lot of information in the rules. Frankly, they're using more information in their rule sets than a lot of developed countries use in their rule forms. So they're really aggressively seeking the value of information. So why is it that that information and two rule forms, two rival framings for the same control, don't give you the same behavior? And so we wanted to get into that. And so in essence, the question that we want to answer here is, what controls the variance of every release action as a function of the input that we give it? So what pieces of information most directly affect the variance of the actions, in essence, the actions that a rule is going to take? And we can do that analytically through a variance decomposition. So in essence, you have a derivative form, and our rule form has the advantage of being pretty easy and directly analytically where you can work with it. So in essence, we're trying to see for each piece of information, how much does it affect the variance of action in a given period of time? So at every release, or every day, or every period, what piece of information is causing it to act? So we can do this for our policy. In essence, you can substitute in direct analytic derivative. In terms of the covariance, we have that data for the inputs and the states of the system. And so we can directly compute that. For their rule, we had to use the central differencing. So in essence, what we did here is we did 1,000 years of synthetic stream flow, and at each day t, we calculated first order Taylor series approximation of the variance. So in essence, we give you this piece of information. How much did it, in this particular period, affect what you did? So we can get first order effects. This is the effect of a piece of information by itself. We can get it as how it works with another piece of information. And we don't go higher than this. And one of the interesting things is that you can have interactions that are negative because you'll have different components that affect your actions in opposing ways, just to sort of illustrate very quickly. So you have sort of second order effects of the two pieces of information, A and B. And if we think about this, you have a case where the covariance is positive, but the effect of the actual information is oppositional. So one increases the action, one decreases the action. And so in that regard, you would get a negative contribution to variance, or a reduction. Likewise, if we move to the second case, you can have a case where your covariance is negative and your directionality of the effective change of a piece of information is positive, and that also will do that. The core of this is there are certain times where two different pieces of information will, in essence, reduce the variability of action. So, more interestingly, just to sort of navigate, these are the inputs that both rule systems had. So you had storages, a forecast, and then we also have a degree of interaction. Here we have monthly sort of time dynamic at the monthly scale, and this is the percent of variance of the action that you're going to take at Hoi Bin for the best hydro policy. One preference, right? You're trying to maximize hydropower. And this is what Hoi Bin is going to do, and this is the variance in every period. So one preference, and so thinking about this action. What does this say? Well, if we look at 1 year, this is a year where they had a 100-year flood, so a 1% likely flood. So it's a challenging year with flood. What you see is you get a dominance of the input of the storage of Hoi Bin, which is not shocking because this is, in essence, one of the larger hydropower. But one of the interesting things about how this works is that you have variance during the flood season of wet years, and then in the intervening years it uses one of the smaller reservoirs to deal with floods. So and then it uses Hoi Bin to basically maximize hydropower. Its biggest reservoir holds storage, so it's in essence not risk averse. And it's using a small reservoir basically to deal with the residual effects of floods. And the other thing is you get these interactions of the information. Now what if we go to bad years for hydropower or a bad year for deficit? One of the interesting things is the information signature changes. Again, this is the releases at Hoi Bin for maximizing hydropower. But you get a path dependency. You get different information signatures and combinations for different events. This means that the rule isn't decomposable. So the first rule says wet, dry, discretion. You can't do that. It's path dependent. If you go into a certain flood, that flood has a unique signature. If you go into a drought, it has a signature. There's path dependence. The other interesting thing is that you get high levels of interactivity here across the systems, and they're different for the different types of extreme that you face. So this in case you're thinking about a year of bad hydropower production, which is different actually than a year of bad agricultural allocation. What if we change preference? We get very risk averse. You get a totally different information signature. So now we have those same, so this is a bad flood year, a bad hydro production year, and a bad deficit year. These are different. And because of the risk aversion, you actually get a lot more interaction in this, and you see a lot more use of forecast. So they're trying to use that forward forecast. For folks that do forecast, these large blue zones mean you better be right, because you're really heavily dependent on that forecast. And so if that forecast gives you negative learning, you're making the wrong decision in that regard. But it's hedging with information in that particular regard. What if we move to a compromise solution? Now you start mixing everything. And so at this point, you get even more complicated information signature for every piece of information, for every period, for every preference. In that regard, it's a wholly non-decomposable problem. We don't treat it like this, and I think this is one of the first studies to show this lack of separability. And if you go and randomly draw the rule forms for reservoirs around the world, they're going to look like the Vietnamese, actually less sophisticated in some sense than the original rule form. So, some interesting notes or challenging. This is what their rule form looks like in the same space for a compromise. It's largely only sensitive to the storage in Hoi Bin. Even though they put all that information into the problem, it's not utilizing it at all. It's not affecting the actions. And it's one of the reasons why it's largely failing to do the level of performance that they expect. Likewise, although usually in graphs it's less exciting to highlight the void, but the void is very important. These are whole swaths of time where none of the information is having any effect on any of the action. So you just inadvertently turned off your entire, here, the equivalent, drive, now close your eyes, keep driving. You lose your feedback. So as we move through sort of these sorts of situational issues, one of the interesting things is you can think of these reservoirs as coordinating or not as agents. If I know what you do, should I do something that is conditioned off what you do? And they should, in essence, be doing that. So we tested that, and if we look, and without diving into a huge amount of detail, what you'll see is that the signatures are actually Son La, Hoi Bin, Tun King, Thak Ba. You get very similar, actually, information signatures across them. So for the rule form that we're using, they're sharing information. There are some nuances, but the reality is that you can see this sort of shared view of the problem and coordinated action. And interactions are extremely significant. So the interaction of information matters. Having combinations of information, not just singular pieces of information. Now, if we move to how their rules look, nothing, significantly, largely nothing, Hoi Bin. So, and this is sort of a peculiar thing. With the intent is to put so much information into what it was originally 1,000 lines of code to guide your actions, to make the right actions subject to the information that you have on hand. And you unintentionally are being, you're not guided. And it makes sense, in a sense, why they're starting to get events that don't make sense downstream based on what they anticipate their action should be doing. And I think this is actually a broader concern. One of the interesting things I would say that we're facing at a more societal level is what is the rate of endogenous learning that we have to do these sorts of counterfactuals? And more difficult would be what's our willingness to actually respond to it through institutional change. In the United States, to change flooding rules requires an act of Congress for U.S. Army Corps regulated dams. So again, here you have a lack of coordinated action, a lack of information sensitivity in a majority of the reservoirs, and in some of them, basically no information feedback. So just to kind of wrap up in terms of a few things that I think have general merit for discussion, there's a variety of ways that these if-then-else rules come into the way that we think about these systems. One is their actual operations. Most operations in the world are in an if-then-else structure. Because one of the things from our legal systems and our right systems and our land rights and our resource rights is that we like to have a clear and transparent rule set of who gets what, when, and how in terms of action. But understanding a rule form is not the same as understanding the consequences of implementing it. And so we're focused on the left side when we should be looking at the right side, which is the consequences of the rules. The other question is, as I showed for the Missouri example at the beginning of the talk, the system is changing at a rate that is outpacing our understanding. So there are a lot of very well operated systems, but there's a limit to how much we understand and how much we can actually change. And one of the interesting questions is, if they were to implement a type of rule form like I showed, that would be similar in implementation to the rule form, but the rule itself is extremely auto-adaptive. It would change adjudication sort of traditions in terms of, because each extreme and each year would have a slightly different effect. And then the question of preference could have a big effect in terms of the information signatures. This is all new. I'd say a lot of folks aren't quite sure how to deal with that. The other wrinkle is our models that we use these if-then-else. Most simulation models use an even simplified version of if-then-else. So those don't actually capture the risks. One of the challenges is, and I didn't go into detail, but we did, I wouldn't say overwhelmingly sophisticated, but a better treatment of variation. So a lot of work goes into making your model fit your historical record, not into thinking about, does that historical record represent the extremes in variability well? By definition, floods and droughts are rare. So even if you have 100 years of data, it's a poor representation of rare floods and droughts. So using the historical record is a structural risk maximization strategy. It underestimates the variability of the system. Thinking about this, abstractions in our models or our assessments in terms of sequential decision making and coordination failures, sectoral conflicts, and the use of information, is going to strongly bias our perceptions of the risk and resilience of the systems themselves in that regard. And lastly, we took a laughingly simple approach to this problem, things we didn't do. We didn't look at sea level rise. We didn't look at making room for the river through a groundwater recharge, for example. There's so many different institutional things that could change, land right things that could change, marketization. So I was in another project with Cambodia and the Chinese in the southern Mekong. If the Cambodians build the reservoir that they're thinking as a possibility, it would quadruple their power output, and they'd likely export it to Vietnam, which would then destabilize their subsidized pricing in the analysis I just showed here. So this sort of mix and mingling of the way that you're thinking about the infrastructure and things like that, and the way that I think the only tractable way forward is thinking about this is sort of with humility and as a learning problem, constructively building different conceptions like this of the problem and evolving in collaboration with the people in it. And in short, I think we just have to be really careful about overestimating our causal understanding in these systems and thinking about the fact that small changes in short time periods or preference can have very, very long-term effects in that regard that currently typically are not characterized. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge, so this was funded through a sustainability research network for NSF. The computing was from Texas Advanced Computing Center. Julie, who's now a faculty down at University of Virginia, and then Matteo and Andrea, and I should acknowledge that they were honored by the European Commission for Responsible Research and Innovation in terms of the impacts that this had for Vietnam. So with that, thank you. Happy to take questions.
With the information that the Vietnamese already have from these different models, are they planning an additional dams further upstream to deal with a 100-year flood or any other
So yes, I think that it's on the table. Things that are changing is, one, the sectoral change in the country is changing, the hydropower dependence. Two is they are thinking about capacity expansion, but that comes at the cost of other capital investments. And so I haven't seen a clear plan, and I think a lot of the capital investments might go towards the Mekong as well. But there is some potential for investment. I think where their focus in the near term is probably thinking more on the operation side of these. But this is still fairly fresh in that regard, so I can't give a definitive answer.
Say a little bit about what happened, what impact did your sort of new model have, and were the rules changed?
I mean, we're at the beginning, right? So what I just showed you is in review, actually. And it's new information. I think they're open to reoperating their system. So there are indications based off RFPs and some of that they're reaching out, in essence, to think about the problem. So in that sense, whether it was us or in general, just the recognition that what they expected as an outcome wasn't the outcome from their implementation of action, that is motivating changes in action. That being said, there's also been big political shifts in terms of the composition of ministries and other things in that regard. So that also is a structural change in the system. It changes who's basically thinking about what values basically dominate in terms of the concern across, well, not just this problem, but their overall problem, and who is the technical point of contact. I'd say more direct for our collaborators in Milan and ourselves, and it would be who would we be, in essence, working with collaboratively. So the synopsis of what I gave here, I mean, started with an Italian foreign ministry sort of collaborative investment with Vietnam 6 or 7 years ago. And so there was a lot of trust building, a lot of sort of co-learning and so co-production of information. And so when you change sort of that institutional composition, you lose some of that investment in terms of you'd have to come back and get people up to speed or back at the table.
in your last slide, you said that basically this work shows that people underestimate climate impacts in that regard. I was interested in whether the Vietnamese government frames it in a climate.
Yeah, they're really concerned about climate change, not just a little bit. Matter of fact, they're going aggressive. So the one thing I would say is quite interesting is they're pushing towards a 500-year level protection to drive even more conservatively. It's a hard thing to do because if you go to a higher level of risk in what's acceptable, you're giving up something, right, in your other dimensions. And so, yeah, I would say they're very concerned. They're very proactive. They're very happy to have information related to climate scenarios, climate in that regard. So, and they actually even sent some of their ministry staff and things like that to conferences related to climate change and uncertainty and decision making and things like that.
I just had a quick question about, on the last slide again, you mentioned that there are a lot of other things you could include in this, and I was curious about environmental flows, if and how those are incorporated into their decision-making process, if there's just sort of a base minimum environmental flow.
You have a base minimum in essence, and sort of that minimum flow that was sort of baked in, I didn't emphasize in terms of their rule, where you have a min release during the dry season, that in essence sort of relates in that regard.
Are there communities that is that like a fourth constituency that could be fighting for?
I mean, you have a lot of complexity here. You have sediment mining in the delta, you have sea level rise, you have a very active estuary feedback. It comes upstream, so if you get a downstream riverine flood that hits at the wrong time in terms of tides and sea level, you get a huge potential amplification. You hit saltwater intrusion in terms of the agricultural components. Yeah, so I mean, I think this is interesting, but yeah, it's still a simplified abstraction in that regard. I would say it's operationally implementable in terms of control, but that being the case. And I think to answer your question maybe a little bit more broadly, the willingness to do that varies pretty dramatically by culture and value system. And even in the United States, it's not always very clear. If I tell you that you need to change operations for an environmental flow, the response might be, show me the fish I saved for $60 million. And so it's a challenging issue. And then in working with actually the Cambodians and the Chinese on the Sambor Dam over the last few years, that dam, if it's built, in essence, has the potential to collapse the southern Mekong and Tonle Sap, the most productive freshwater fishery in the world. So that's 80% of the Cambodian protein. And so part of that conversation was just literally arguments across the engineers, the economists, the ecologists of even how to represent the problem.
Follow-up to that, the phrase non-structural alternatives is used widely in the hydrology conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Floodplain zoning in Hanoi, things like that would change some of these
Mm-hmm.
constraints quite dramatically.
I mean, physical breach they're going to want to avoid just because that puts the physical system in danger, but for sure. The other thing is you could change, I mean, the idea for like make room for the river is if you do an upland and you take certain land and then you change its use classification such that it's going to distribute a flood wave periodically. I mean, the example would be the Dutch, but there's a lot of potential for there. So any solution that they implement is going to have to sort of have a soft side. And I would say even what I'm showing here is sort of more soft. It's not building new reservoirs, it's reoperating them in a way that uses information. So that's one of the things people are heavily investing in right now and thinking about how does information change the trade-offs that we can attain.
So I wonder that when the river basins are like divided by the country boundaries, like the Nile River basin, the upstream is in one country, I wonder, in this case, how do you
So for trans-basin cases that you're crossing national boundaries, I mean, it's an interesting question. So, I mean, in the paper that we just published this year, we showed that when the Chinese filled their reservoir storage at the top of the Mekong, that it actually physically moved through a stochastic 1,000-year sort of very similar representation of the variability. It went from the wettest to the driest through manual action. In essence, to put it in simpler terms, they can manually make choices with their storages that will navigate the entire historical variability that we know about through active choice, not through experience in that regard. There's also work by actually Andrea in terms of the sediment effects and sediment transport effects, and the fact that you start trapping sediments in this country at above, and that sediment doesn't become available for nutrients and ecological response. And there's nonlinear thresholds there. And there are a lot of places, particularly if you start to think about Africa and investments in the Zambezi or the GERD or things like that, where there's legitimate potential for significant tension in terms of how you build the infrastructure and coordinate it.
To the point of the complexity of the interaction between different factors for consequences, sort of short of having more complex ifs than else kind of rules, are there better ways of representing those and getting people to learn?
I mean, it's a debate that we're having actually in the community. Not everybody is super thrilled by my conclusion that there's non-separability, because that has sort of very large implications for what people are currently doing. And so there's an argument is, can we actually do a better representation of the if than else in the problem? Now, the hesitance I have in that is that from a mathematics perspective, I'm trying to create a discrete representation into a path-dependent nonlinear system. And so, I don't know if this makes sense, but my way of thinking about that is that feels like a restricted vocabulary of choice relative to the sort of potential for very state-dependent and specific conditions that you may face that are unique. So, but yeah, it's an active debate, and there are going to be papers fighting back and forth on that particular topic.
There aren't any more questions. I think I'll speak about.
Thank you.